Hey, y'all, Brandon Adams, DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hello to you, and thanks for being with us today. We are, as you know, fully loaded. A lot on JJ Holloman and the unfortunate news that happened there on Friday, shocking as it was, that he will no longer be a part of the Georgia program. We'll deal with that a lot today. We'll also start the program with a little bit of recruiting talk on the heels of Akinola Ogunbiyi's decommitment from Georgia, kind of where all of this goes now, and we'll see if we can kind of piece all this together and kind of figure out what it all means, because just given the fact that Ogunbiyi had been such an outspoken proponent of Georgia, the news as it is seems surprising. Jeff Sintel had some good reporting on this. We'll do all that. Our buddy Mike Johnson going to be back on the program today. So there is a lot going on, and we'll try to sift our way and work our way through it all. We're glad you're with us as DawgNation Daily begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
If you were watching on Friday, we were live when JJ Holloman, the news involving him, was announced, covered by the Covington News, newspaper in the state of Georgia that breaks that story, that Holloman's no longer a part of the Georgia roster. I had some thoughts on it then. I've got more thoughts to get in throughout our program today, both in terms of what this means on a personal situation for how we should all react to this involving a guy that Georgia fans have come to love in Holloman. I'll deal with that. I will also deal with the football part of this, because after all, we are a football show. This is, in a roundabout way, still a football story, so we'll do all that coming up. Let me do something else, though, on the more recent news before we get to the Holloman stuff. And I'm going to try to see if I can spin this forward and kind of decide what's going to happen next. I was very surprised, as many of you probably were, kind of, what seemed to me almost kind of out of nowhere, that the four-star offensive lineman Akinola Ogunbiyi, one of those really good-looking offensive line prospects Jeff Sintel had written a great profile of a couple times, really, at DawgNation.com. Interesting personality. A guy that seemingly loved Georgia, had been really outspoken, pushing guys to Georgia, being a strong recruiter for the Dogs and doing a lot of that kind of stuff. And then suddenly, all out of nowhere, Ogunbiyi's flipping. Really, it's hardly even a flip. He doesn't really announce any kind of decommitment from Georgia. He simply says on Twitter, this is yesterday, my recruiting is 100% over. I'll be playing football and attending the Texas A&M University gig him, and he goes on, and you see the picture there if you're watching on video of him there in College Station, Texas. He is now part of the Texas A&M program. Now, a little backstory on this. Before many of us were probably paying that much attention to Ogunbiyi, it is probably fair to say that he was at one point in time an Aggies commit. So this is, in a lot of ways, almost like a Warren Brinson situation, where Brinson had committed to Georgia, then outside of the Georgia program, and now recommitted. Ogunbiyi, I guess, kind of doing the same thing here with Texas A&M, kind of gravitating back to a program that he initially had some interest with. A little extra context on all of this is the fact that Jeff, our buddy Jeff Sintel, had some really good recruiting, really good reporting, the other word, really good reporting, catching up with Ogunbiyi after he made that announcement on social media. And Ogunbiyi did give us a little more information as to kind of what's going on here. And I think one of the things that some of the Georgia fans will take from this is, on the basis of the report that you can read for yourself right now at DawgNation.com, apparently there are no hard feelings with Ogunbiyi towards Georgia at all. This is, for him, apparently a family situation. I think we have something we can show here. Yeah, here's what Ogunbiyi says to DawgNation about all this. Just let them know no love was lost for Georgia. I loved it there and loved the staff. I just had to make the best decision for my mom. And the reference to his mom is the fact that she had a stroke, and I guess her recovery from that stroke is not going as well as maybe Ogunbiyi wishes that it was. He doesn't feel comfortable being away from her right now. It seems like, there's never any shortage of these. It seems like we've heard a lot of examples of this lately where, guys have a chance to go play big-time college football, but when they have a family situation, especially something involving health, that ends up being a thing that kind of pulls them back to their home state. In the case of Ogunbiyi, that seems to be what's going on here. So, first of all, I appreciate Akinola just being willing to be forthcoming and open about that. He didn't owe us any kind of explanation on that, but he does give one to DawgNation readers there by saying, yeah, listen, I've got this family situation. Here's what's going on, and this is the reason why I now think Texas A&M's the best spot for me, and he was good enough to talk to us there about DawgNation.com with that. And I'm going to let those words from Akinola kind of stand on their own. However, it is also fair to say at Georgia, from a football standpoint, that this is kind of a part of a continuing, maybe mystery is the right word to use here, continuing mystery about how Georgia was going to fit all these offensive linemen and what it's trying to do as well. Because, Jeff's been telling us, hey, Georgia may try to take as many as 6 offensive linemen. But can you take that many in a year in which numbers are already limited in some form or fashion? Georgia probably signs less than 25 guys this year. The actual total number may be still somewhat up in the air, but it's likely less than 25. At least that's the way it's been treated for most of the time kind of leading up to this. Could you fit that many offensive linemen in there? And Georgia seems to be in kind of good shape for a couple guys like Andrew Raym out of Oklahoma and Sedrick Van Pran out of Louisiana. Can you add them to what you already have, and can you find a way to balance out your class with that many offensive linemen? Well, in some form or fashion, the Ogunbiyi story is kind of a continuation of that question. And so now with Ogunbiyi out of the mix for Georgia, boy, there's a lot more attention that's going to be paid to Sedrick Van Pran, who I just mentioned, Andrew Raym, who I just mentioned, and I guess there's a little bit of news involving both of them. Not unsurprising, at least in the case of Andrew Raym, who was at Georgia last week and had a great time with all of that, really seemed to enjoy himself. But we knew on the heels of that Georgia visit, Raym would also be taking another visit after that, and indeed that did go down. He was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, visiting the Michigan Wolverines this past weekend. We got a picture of that we can show to our video audience. You got the Jordan brand logo behind. I'll always think this is weird. I know the kids love the Jordan brand stuff, but Michael Jordan was not a football player, nor did he go to Michigan. I always think it's weird when they got on the wall back there like the Jordan brand thing. It just seems like a kind of a weird thing to really highlight. But obviously, I'm 1,000 years old, and that's probably intended for a lot younger eyes than mine, of course. But Andrew Raym was at Michigan. My assumption is that visit probably went well. Those visits all seem to always do. And yet, I think for Georgia fans, there is probably still a strong sense that Georgia's sitting pretty good, I'm guessing, for Andrew Raym, even after the Michigan visit, because that's how strongly they felt before that. But with Ogunbiyi no longer in this class, boy, that really becomes extra important. All of a sudden, closing on a Raym, keeping him from going to an in-state school like Oklahoma or one of the other schools that he's considering, all of a sudden that becomes a lot more important now that Akinola Ogunbiyi has kind of decided that there's a school out there that's better for him, and Georgia's going to focus some of its offensive line recruiting on some of these other guys. Suddenly that becomes more important. And the situation for Sedrick Van Pran becomes even more interesting than that, because let's face it, Van Pran is from New Orleans, and Georgia fans a year ago got their fill of going into Louisiana and trying to pull a top prospect out of that state that LSU wanted. With John Emery Jr., ultimately, it didn't work out so well. They held that commitment for a while, and then ultimately LSU won that battle. With Van Pran now out of New Orleans, is that really the kind of place that Georgia can go into and get this highly regarded, top-rated center? Is that really what Georgia's going to be able to do? Well, when it comes to Sam Pittman, most Georgia fans would tell you there's something that he can't do when it comes to all this kind of stuff, even going into Louisiana. And on Van Pran's case, that may once again prove to be true there as well. But with Ogunbiyi no longer in the fold, the Van Pran recruitment, much like the Raym recruitment, becomes all the more important. The extra complication, or maybe the extra layer of intrigue, maybe that's a better way to say this, the extra layer of intrigue when it comes to Van Pran is, and Jeff Sintel had some good reporting on this at the forum at forum.DawgNation.com, and a quick aside here, if you're not checking in on this forum, which is a totally free message board, one of the things that Jeff is starting to do, and I've shown you some of this kind of stuff on the air, I think it's a really clever thing, he's taking some of what he calls kind of his hurry-up intel, the Sintel intel, the long pieces that you see at DawgNation.com with the recruiting information, a lot shorter, a lot more kind of bullet point type stuff he's putting in the forum, and it's really good recruiting information. It's totally free, so make sure you check that out at the forum at forum.DawgNation.com. But inside the forum recently, Jeff was able to confirm some news that's been out there that Van Pran was rumored to be visiting Georgia this past weekend, and now that visit did not go down. Now, what complicates this situation just a bit is the fact that we are now coming up on a recruiting dead period. So this would have been Georgia's last chance to host Van Pran for a while. The dead period starts today. Yeah, so we're on that dead period right now. So, Georgia had a chance to host him right before that, and now won't get a chance to do that. And no telling how much pull he's going to get from his home state, while Georgia is prohibited from making contact with him here. So that's kind of the complication with all of that. Now, this may all work out really well. Ogunbiyi may find a good home there in College Station, likely will, and Georgia may get these two guys that it's been strongly rumored to be in the mix for as of late, Van Pran and Andrew Raym. It may all work out, but it's one of those things we're going to have to watch and see. The overall bottom line, though, I think is kind of summed up by Jeff Sentell. With the work that Sam Pittman is doing, with the guys already in the fold, now minus Ogunbiyi, and the guys that could still be out there like Raym and Van Pran, this still has a chance to be a historically good offensive line haul for Georgia in its 2020 class. In fact, here is Jeff from not all that long ago giving voice to just that very point.
With Raym and Van Pran, if those guys do eventually matriculate to the University of Georgia, or either one of the two, you're going to look at what Georgia did in 2017 with Andrew Thomas and Isaiah Wilson, and then you've got Notori Johnson and Justin Schaefer. You're going to see the 2018 class, which included Salyer, Mays, Condon, Trey Hill, and Warren Erickson. In 2019, with one, if Georgia finishes out with one or both of those guys, that is Sam Pittman's finest work for the Georgia Bulldogs.
I think the overall point to take away here, even without Akinola Ogunbiyi, that greatness of that offensive line haul, that the quality of that group, I think that point still remains true. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hello to you, and thanks for being with us. Live on video, 10 a.m., DawgNation, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Radio Noon, of course, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we're available as a podcast wherever you find them, Apple, Google, everything else in between. Coming soon, I'm told, on Spotify. Our buddy Connor Riley's going to help us out with that. We're going to see if we can get that locked down here pretty soon. But also the world-famous DawgNation.com, which I know many of you use to listen to our program. We're just glad to have you on DawgNation Daily. Speaking of DawgNation.com, hope you'll go there to find out more information about DawgNation Days of Summer. Y'all, we had a great time most recently at our last event. Our next event's going to be just as much fun. Thursday, August 1st, we're going to be at Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. Now, it's in Towns County, Georgia, North Georgia Mountains. Could not be better. Y'all, we want to get there, and you want to get your room booked. We've only got a couple of these VIP situations left. It's going to work very much like the first event did, where we'll have a big event open to the public starting at 6 p.m., a VIP event, reception anyway. That night will start around 5. You'll be able to get in, be a part of that. We'll have some giveaways, some sort of special stuff for our VIPs there. So the way to get yours secured is by booking your room. Go to DawgNation.com. You can find your link to DawgNation Days of Summer. Get on in there and do that. My understanding is we're going to do a golf outing again on that Friday. Boy, can't wait for that. My golf game is not very good, but I have a good time doing it, and I'll have a good time doing that with you. Cannot wait for DawgNation Days of Summer on all of that. DawgNation.com for more details. We got Mike Johnson here coming up in a moment. A lot of subjects I want to get into with Mike. One of the things, we'll do a lot of the offensive line recruiting stuff because Mike knows a lot of these offensive line prospects. We were just talking. We'll do some of that with him. But I'll also address the big news of the weekend for Georgia, and that's the situation involving JJ Holloman. Now, many of you by now are aware of this. Covington News broke this story. In that story, it is alleged that Holloman admitted to punching a girl that he was dating last April. This wasn't made aware of to UGA police until just earlier this month, so no reason to think Georgia knew anything about this before the start of this month when the investigation goes down. But once the facts became clear, apparently Kirby Smart has made a bold stroke decision to remove Holloman from the team. In fact, I think we have the quote from Kirby that we can show here. He says, Jeremiah Holloman no longer represents the University of Georgia football program. We expect every member of our team to uphold the highest standards and values of the University of Georgia and Georgia football. It's disappointing when this does not happen. That is Georgia coach Kirby Smart. Listen, I have a lot of feelings about this. Almost all of them are complicated. First and foremost, my feelings go out to the young lady involved in this situation because, there's nothing worse than the feeling of not feeling safe and kind of an intimate relationship, and apparently that's the allegation that goes down here, which is a very sad thing for her. And then when it comes to Holloman, when these allegations come out against him, obviously the Georgia brand means too much. It's too big. It's too valuable. It's too important to people in the state of Georgia to have it tarnished by a connection to this allegation right now, which allegedly Holloman admitted to, according to what the Covington News reported. So Georgia, Kirby Smart really had no choice here. They had to move swiftly. They had to act boldly, and they did do that. And yet, while I am going to, in the one hand, say Georgia did exactly what it had to do and really had no choice to do otherwise, That doesn't mean that I think that society should toss Holloman aside. That doesn't mean that I think Holloman should have doors closed to him to ever play football again. I think that he can learn from this, and I think that he can grow from this. And, giving my full level of empathy over to the young lady involved in this doesn't mean that I don't have any empathy left over to give to Holloman. And some people say, well, how can you feel bad for him? This was a mistake. This was an action of his own doing. He's the one that put himself in this position. Listen, when it comes to care and concern for people, I'm grateful that doesn't just extend to those who deserve it, because there'd be probably plenty of times in my life when I didn't deserve care and concern from other people. So, I still have a lot of, feelings and affection for Holloman, a guy that I've loved playing football, a guy that I've loved watching play football. I mean, my hope is that he can learn from this situation, maybe get the help that he needs to make better choices in the future. And, college is a time for learning and growth. It's a time for development and finding out who you are as a person. And sometimes that's in the classroom, and sometimes that involves academics. Sometimes it involves things maybe far more important than that. Holloman now is going to go on a pretty significant journey to kind of figure out what went wrong here and how to do better in the future. And I'm still going to be cheering for him as he goes down that path. And unfortunately, that path no longer includes the University of Georgia. Later on, we'll talk more about what this means for the Dogs from a football stance, but did want to at least off the top here kind of speak about the Holloman as a person and what Georgia has lost with him kind of no longer in connection to this. We'll do more on that later on. We'll also kind of get back to the business of some of the recruiting stuff and the offensive line. We'll welcome back an old friend. It's good to have Mike Johnson here on DawgNation Daily. And you know what? I always love talking to this guy, and it's always a fun time to have him on the program. In a moment, we will get to some happier stuff when it involves the offensive lineman and kind of where Georgia's kind of looking to fill out its 2020 class and what it means now that Akinola Ogunbiyi is not a part of this 2020 class anymore. But, Mike, before we do that, I think I'm doing a disservice to our audience if I didn't further the conversation we were just having. I'll kind of remind everybody of the details here. JJ Holloman was Georgia's leading returning receiver, but now he's not going to be on this roster anymore because of a pretty strong allegation of hitting a woman, a girl that Holloman was apparently dating more than a year or so ago. And, Mike, I think you'd agree with me that when it comes to dismissing Holloman from the team, which is what Smart has done, Georgia probably had no choice but to do that. And yet, if you're in that locker room, and you've been in these locker rooms at both the NFL and the major college level, if you're in that locker room, Holloman's loss is going to be felt, not just for what he brings on the field, but for the relationship he had with his players. This is probably a little bit of a confusing time for this Georgia football team, is it not?
Oh, there's no question about it. I mean, this would be, akin to when I was back in college losing Julio Jones, going into the 2009 season. I mean, that's how big of a player, and that's how much I believe JJ Holloman meant. But I think you hit the nail on the head, BA, and I think most of the fans would agree. Not only because of what he did, but the time in which he does it, it says everything. You just cannot go out and have these kind of violent things going on and expect to stay part of a big football program like Georgia. Kirby Smart had no choice but to do what he had to do to get rid of JJ Holloman and to make sure his team understood the difference between right and wrong. And I think he made the right decision. It's a tough one, and it is going to be felt throughout the football team, but it was the right decision, and you just have to understand. And I think I heard a little bit there at the end before I got on the phone with you that this is a guy that by no means should doors be closed to him for the rest of his life, but this is going to be a learning moment for him. He's going to have to understand that the things that he did and the actions he took, and accountability is a big part of this, have led to where he's at right now. So definitely a tough loss, and hopefully the kid and everybody involved in the situation can find a way to make peace.
Let me bring this back to the football part of this for a moment, because you mentioned Julio Jones, a guy that came in as a highly regarded freshman when you were already on the Alabama roster. Now, I always think it's really interesting, the school that you play for, Alabama, how similar certain things are to what Georgia's going through right now. And in one instance, that's also true, just given the fact that Georgia's also now presumably going to look to some freshman wide receivers. George Pickens is coming in, a highly regarded five-star. Dominic Blaylock is not a five-star, and yet he certainly played like it to my eyes and to a lot of the people who watched him in his final year there at Walton High School. And I know you saw Dominic up close and personal at one point in time this past season. When you're a player, I'm sure there's probably some thought in your mind of, hey, can this freshman come in and really be good? And obviously, in the case of Julio Jones, it turned out that he has chance. He was every bit as good as the recruiting rankings would have suggested he was. And now for Georgia, they're hoping the same thing is true for Pickens, and the same thing is true for Blaylock. It is true that we do live in an age in which freshman receivers can make the impact that Jones once made, and Justin Ross made last year for Clemson. A lot of other examples that it's never been seemingly easier for freshman receivers to come in and make a big impact. And for Georgia, that's good news because they really need that to happen this year.
Well, absolutely. You have to have the depth, and especially at a position like wide receiver, BA. I know that you'll echo my sentiment on that. When you play wide receiver, that's one of the positions you can easily step in as a freak athlete, and it lays everybody else at ease. You get a number one wide receiver that shows up, then the guy that was number one gets to slot down to number two. Then all of a sudden he's seeing less press coverage. Then all of a sudden the number two guy gets slotted to maybe an inside receiver spot, and all of a sudden everything starts to open up in that passing attack. It makes things a lot easier on your quarterback and your offensive line. And just talking about Julio and the impact he had on our team at Bama, back 10 years ago, he changed the entire dynamic of the program from a work ethic standpoint to an athleticism standpoint to what he allowed us to do on the perimeter in these one-on-one matchups. Teams could no longer just load the box. I mean, you can make a difference as a true freshman wide receiver in some of the things you do on the field. So, I listened, and you mentioned I saw Dominic Blaylock up close and personal. Kid is an absolute game changer at wide receiver, and there's a number of those guys headed into the Georgia program that'll be trying to make those moves. So, a lot of incredible talent. It's just going to have to be who can learn this offense, who can learn the dynamics of the ins and outs of what they're supposed to do, and who can make that impact in the fall.
So Akinola Ogunbiyi is a four-star offensive lineman, was a Georgia commit, has decommitted, chosen to go to Texas A&M instead. He's kind of cited family concerns on this. Mike, you grew up in Pensacola, ended up playing your football in Tuscaloosa. And, that's not the longest way away, but you're not, like, right next door to home either. And, if you had some sort of major family situation going on, which Ogunbiyi apparently does, I'm sure that distance would start to feel even longer. A lot of times we forget, I think, what it's like to no longer be in your hometown anymore, away from home for the first time, and have a spotlight on you the way that major college football players do. And for Ogunbiyi, given what he's going through right now, that apparently was going to be a little too much for him at this point in time. I think given the fact that you've been in his footsteps, in his shoes before, leaving home to go to another state to play football, not the same family situation, but certainly, getting used to living in a new place for the first time, you as much as anybody else can probably understand a little bit about that, right?
Well, and I applaud it, BA. I mean, the simple fact is that any kind of decommitment will hurt for the Georgia coaching staff and the football team, the fan base, for just a little bit. But in my eyes, and you've been around recruiting, and people watching the show have been around recruiting, you'd rather see it right now than him to show up on campus maybe as an early enrollee or a guy who gets in the summer and then all of a sudden wants to enter the transfer portal and wants to head back home. You'd rather see it right now. You'd rather see a kid grow up during this recruiting process and not have to grow up in his first year of college and it be worse off for everybody. So definitely, hoping the best for him. I understand that, his mom's had some health problems and just wanted to stay closer to home and be a part of, what Texas A&M is doing. And I certainly understand that. He's a quality football player. I think definitely he's got a little bit of work to do as far as footwork goes. He's a little bit of a grabber up top, but going to be a quality football player wherever he decides to go. And like I said, I have to tip my cap to him that he realized a lot of the things about what was needed in a college decision before making that decision, as opposed to being a guy who signed on the dotted line because it sounded good, and then showing up 3 states or 4 states away and saying, man, I really don't want to be here.
Yeah, I will let people know that we're actually going to be doing another one of those series of Real Talks with you on Before the Hedges presented by Kroger, where you help us break down some of these offensive linemen. It sounds like Ogunbiyi's a guy you've seen a little bit of, and I am a little curious about this. From a player's standpoint, what has gotten away from Georgia here? I know Ogunbiyi, even his own words, will say that his own high school career hasn't probably prepared him for everything that's going to be going on at the college level because his team doesn't throw the ball very much. It doesn't do a whole lot of pass blocking. But what have you seen from Ogunbiyi, and what is Georgia now not going to be getting now that he's on his way to College Station?
Well, I think he's a quality football player. Like I said, I don't see him as kind of a day one guy. Georgia's been very lucky recently to see some guys step on the campus and be immediately ready to play. I don't know if I saw that from him. And I use the term grabber sometimes when you're evaluating some of these high school offensive linemen, because when you have a guy at his size and stature, sometimes it becomes easier to just grab the smaller guy. You know, some of these 200, 180-pound linebackers you might be going up against, and use your grip strength that way. But, you know, a lot of times guys that are grabbers in high school, when they show up to college, those become holding calls, and they don't get away with those as much as they used to. And I think he's, like I said, he moves well in space. I think he moves well for his body size, and, you know, he's kind of that prototypical guy. But you're going to have to work on some foot speed. He's a kid that, obviously, watching his tape, he understands angles, he understands football and the dynamics around a lot of the running plays. But going to have to work on foot speed and foot acceleration, so that when he does get his hands on a lot of these guys, he'll see at the next level that he is able to finish them without, kind of getting those holding calls. But a quality player, and, he's going to be a good piece wherever he decides to land.
How about Sedrick Van Pran, who we talked about before you came on the show, big-time center out of New Orleans. Now, I'm going to do this with you two ways. On the one hand, as I said before, you came in on the show today, you know, Georgia fans have had their fill of going to Louisiana and trying to win a recruiting battle for a major recruit. It didn't work out last year for a running back when it comes to John Emery Jr., and I think that Emery's going to be one of the best players in the LSU roster this season. I think that's a pretty big loss, all things being, considered for Georgia. And now trying to go back into Louisiana again with a big-time offensive lineman. Now, Sam Pittman doesn't lose a lot of these head-to-head battles, but that's going to be a tough recruitment. But it sounds like, and I'm sure you're going to echo these sentiments, that Van Pran, the kind of player as a interior offensive lineman, that if you got a chance to win that, no matter how difficult the recruiting battle is, you got to go out there and do it, because it sounds like this young man brings a lot to the table.
There's no doubt about it. And he plays, B.A. watching his film, with an upper body violence that you don't see much in high school. I mean, he really has an explosive bench press. I have no idea how much he benches, but you can tell he has an explosive upper body. Now, sometimes that does lead to him being more of a waist bender, because he does get away with so much with upper body strength. But for what he's being asked to do in high school and what he'll be asked to do at the next level, there's no question that it translates. I mean, any kind of kid, and honestly, I was kind of shocked to see that he was listed online at 305 pounds. This is a guy, to me, he looks like he plays at about 280 because his arms are so quick. Usually I don't see that with a guy that's over the 300-pound plateau that's 17 years old. But he's a guy who's got a quick, violent upper body. He can shove guys around the run game. He gets great extension when he needs to. And when you have extension and you are a 6'5" body, the leverage that you get is unparalleled. That's why these colleges love these tall offensive linemen. So, he's a guy that I think is going to do great, and he'll have to work on his hip strength as well and kind of sit back into his legs. But he's going to be a solid piece, and boy, if Georgia can land him, he's got a bright, bright future ahead of him there in Athens.
Let me do one more player before we let you go, and of course, for folks who are curious about more of this, Mike's, as I said, going to be a part of an upcoming series of videos on Before the Hedges presented by Kroger, breaking down more of these offensive line names. It's Andrew Raym. He's out of Oklahoma. The Sooners, the reigning Joe Moore Award winner for the top offensive line a year ago. This is another state it's tough to go into and pull out a big-time offensive lineman. Raym took his official visit to Georgia 2 weekends ago, seemed to really love it. Georgia fans, even after Raym visited Michigan this past weekend, think they could be sitting in okay position for Raym. It sounds like this is also an offensive lineman that Georgia would really like to get. Is that fair?
It's definitely fair. And I honestly think that he's the best of the three guys we've talked about so far. He's got the combination of being a little bit of a gripper up top, like I said, but he has the foot acceleration to go along with it. And I think that's very, very exciting when you look at Georgia in the run game and how much they love to run the football. This is not Oklahoma. Oklahoma's going to air things out a lot. They do a lot of running blocking as well, but Georgia, the way they like to ground and pound, I think Raym fits what they want to do and what Sam Pittman wants very, very well. Now, I think he has a lot of work to do as far as pass sets go. I think he's a guy that's going to have to learn to not play on his toes in the pass game. He's a guy that's going to show up and he's going to start to understand that my calf muscles aren't as strong as my quads and my hips and all the other stuff. Don't play on your toes in pass protection. But as far as physical skill set, I think he's the best of the three. And like you said, you're able to go into Oklahoma and get that guy over to Georgia and Athens. That not only makes your program look great, that also may start to chip away at some of the other programs around, and he's going to be a quality player as well.
Boy, Mike, it's incredible to have that kind of evaluation of these offensive linemen. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for sharing that with us here on DawgNation Daily. I'm going to look forward to seeing a bunch more from you on Before the Hedges presented by Kroger here coming up when you kind of get into a little bit more detail on these guys. It's just fun talking football with you again, and we'll look forward to getting a chance to do that again very soon.
Can't wait to do it, B.A. See you soon, buddy.
Good stuff there from Mike Johnson, the great SEC analyst and a good friend of us here on DawgNation Daily. I want to go back to something he was saying about Julio Jones before, because this is one thing we did not get into in this particular discussion, but it is important to add here. Mike, if you talk to him now, I mean, he just rattled off a whole bunch of details about Sedrick Van Pran and Andrew Raym and all these guys. Mike follows recruiting pretty closely now because he's, I think, grown to appreciate the value that it has in determining who's going to be successful in college football, and not just for, a program like here on DawgNation Daily where we cover Georgia, but his own alma mater in Alabama and everything else. Mike's grown to appreciate the value of recruiting. But he'll be the first to tell you that is not always the way that he was. And in his own football career, that was especially true. I mean, he's told stories in the past of being a veteran guy, at Alabama going into what would have been, the 2008 signing class, I think, for a Julio. And, Mike didn't know who any of these guys were. If you're a player, all you worry about your own performance, your own career. And all of a sudden you hear about these guys getting all this attention, Julio Jones especially, as a receiver. And, when you're the one that's been working and grinding and fighting on a college practice field for all these years, there's a little something a little distasteful or a little, kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth when somebody else is the one that's getting all the attention, these new guys coming in. But he's told you, I'm not telling you anything that he hasn't said publicly on some of the shows that we've done together before. When he saw Julio with his own eyes, he understood what the big deal was about, that, this was more than just a typical college freshman. This was the kind of guy that had a chance to be special, and for Alabama, to its credit, Julio Jones turned out to be exactly that. Now Georgia finds itself in the same position. I would never begin to tell you that George Pickens is the next Julio Jones, because none of us know. I'll never pretend to tell you that Dominic Blaylock is the next Julio Jones, because none of us know. But what we all kind of assume now is, with Georgia subtracting another experienced receiver off of its roster, it's a little more pressure on Blaylock and Pickens now. Certainly there's a lot more expectations on them. They go from being a luxury of, hey, it'd be nice if they played well, to, boy, it's a real problem for Georgia if they don't play well. That's a different kind of situation for Georgia to find itself in when it comes to those two guys this year. But Mike has seen it with his own eyes, freshman working out before, and for Georgia in 2019, they may be able to repeat that history once again. Let's roll on, do a little more DawgNation Daily. We'll get ready to.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
All right, really good stuff as always when it comes to our buddy Mike Johnson. Really appreciate him sharing his thoughts on the offensive line recruits that Georgia's chasing down, on kind of, where Georgia goes when it comes to that wide receiver situation. That's not a fun conversation to be able to have, but it's good to be able to have Mike's expertise on it. So really glad about that. Before we do our SEC Through, let me also tell you about something interesting from Kroger. One of the things that Kroger likes to do is be creative in coming up with all ways to save you money. That's both in the store when you're buying the things your family needs, the groceries and whatnot, but it's also when it comes to filling up gas in your tank and everything else. So how about this? How about a Kroger Fuel VIP program? This has just started, and it's a chance for customers to earn 2 fuel points on purchase instead of just 1. So you're essentially doubling your fuel point opportunities. Enrollment's super easy. You can scan the barcode at checkout, or you can enroll online with this website, Kroger.com/FuelVIP. Kroger.com/FuelVIP. Now, the annual enrollment's just $40, and it's well worth it because you get 2 fuel points for every dollar spent. Check that out at your local Kroger. All right, let us talk about some SEC stuff here just for a moment. And let me start with another recruit apparently connected to Texas A&M. Now, I said this on, was it DawgNation Daily on Friday? I said this to Jeff on one of our shows this past week. I am wrong about plenty. You can go through the list and find a ton of stuff I've been wrong about. I've never been, though, less happy to be right about something. And that's the situation involving 5-star running back Zach Evans. When Evans initially announced his top 5 finalist, and it didn't include Texas or Texas A&M, something about that just seemed a little fishy to me. And I think at the time we all said, ooh, I'm not quite so sure I'm going to count out the Longhorns and the Aggies in this recruitment. And frankly, I've even gone so far as to say their exclusion from Evans' top 5 just leads me to believe how strongly he feels about them, because, to be super philosophical for a moment, the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is kind of indifference, and I think it's pretty clear that Evans wasn't indifferent to Texas or Texas A&M. Maybe he just didn't really feel like they were showing him the degree of love that he wanted to be shown. Maybe that's starting to change. As we mentioned on Friday at DawgNation Daily, Austin American Statesman and other media outlets reporting that Evans was set to take an unofficial visit to Austin, and apparently he's also taken another visit to Texas A&M there as well. We know that because Evans put this up there on his Twitter feed. In fact, if you're watching on video, I'll show you the pic of Evans in College Station. He says Houston to a College Station ? And there's a photo with him and some other folks wearing that unmistakable Aggie maroon there. So he was in Texas A&M this past weekend. This is going to be, I guess, one of those situations where, as we've said before, if you were to compare Georgia to the other stated finalists for Evans, I don't think there's any reason why Georgia shouldn't be able to win that battle over Alabama, even though Alabama gave the commitment to Dameon Pierce. I'd still feel, not Dameon George. I always say Dameon Pierce. Dameon Pierce is a Florida running back from Kirby Smart's hometown of Bainbridge. Dameon George is the offensive lineman that Alabama gave the scholarship offer to. Head-to-head versus Alabama, I think Georgia can easily win that. Head-to-head versus LSU, given LSU signed so many running backs a year ago, I think Georgia can win that. Ohio State, we've been led to believe the relationship between Evans and the Buckeyes not that great. Georgia could win that. Oklahoma's got a couple running back commits already. Georgia's got a better history of using running backs as it is. So against all the finalists, I think you can come up with a pretty good reason why Georgia could go head-to-head there. But against the in-state situation, given the fact that Evans is from Houston, that was always going to be the toughest recruiting battle. And by the way, I say all these things about Evans independent of Kendall Milton. As you all know, I have been of the belief that it would be possible for Georgia to sign both of these guys. Ultimately, I think, though, the in-state pull for Evans is apparently still pretty strong here, and North Texas A&M is going to give up on this without any kind of significant fight. So there is where things stand with Evans, apparently in College Station and reported to have been in Austin. So we will see where this goes next. A couple other quick stories here. I saw where Steve Spurrier is apparently opening a restaurant, and I guess he's going to have a press conference today at noon, I believe, basically seeking an investor to come along with him on this. Let me tell you this right now. I wouldn't get in business with Steve Spurrier if you gave me 100% stake in the entire company. Given the way that he turned tail and quit on South Carolina when things were not going well, you think he would do anything any different when it comes to this restaurant whatsoever? There's not a chance in the world that Steve Spurrier wants to work hard enough to run a restaurant. Oh, we have a lot of friends that watch and listen to the show every day who are kind of in that business. They'll be the first to tell you that is no easy thing to do if you're not 100% focused and dedicated. And listen, even when Steve Spurrier was in his prime, I don't think that, being a hard worker was necessarily his calling card. So there is that. And by the way, SEC will be represented by Vanderbilt in the College World Series final. I will tell you, after Georgia lost, I didn't watch a single pitch of anything, not Super Regional, not World Series, or anything else. But it seems like it's probably been a pretty good tournament there in Omaha thus far. And against Michigan, you don't see a lot of Big Ten representation sometimes in the College World Series. But Vanderbilt versus Michigan, no word if Jim Abbott and Barry Larkin will be available to the Wolverines in that game. But nonetheless, that will be your College World Series final, and we'll make that your SEC through. And here on DawgNation Daily for just a couple minutes, I want to do, and we'll do a lot more on this in the days ahead because this is a pretty big subject to deal with. I want to do a little more on the situation involving Georgia receiver now that JJ Holloman's not in the mix. One of the things I talked about on Friday when we did our Facebook Live broadcast, reacting to this in the moment, is that when it comes to the offensive skill positions, experience at wide receiver seems to matter more than the other positions do. As Bill Conley from Football Study Halls reported, there's a stronger correlation to that position returning experience and winning than running back, than quarterback, even offensive line, according to Conley, and that's probably a little bit surprising for some people. However, Connor Riley wrote something interesting at DawgNation.com today that I thought was worth maybe kicking around and pondering just for a moment. His overall takeaway is how Georgia's leading receiver needs to perform this year in comparison to what previous leading receivers have done in the college football playoff era, and we've certainly talked plenty about that here on our show. But he also addressed the fact that, two of Georgia's receivers have experience, just not at Georgia. Demetrius Robertson had a pretty big year for Cal, but he did that in a Bears uniform. Lawrence Cager caught 6 touchdowns for Miami last year, but that was not in a Georgia uniform. So I think it leads me to ask a question of how much does experience matter and count if the experience came in somebody else's uniform? Because historically, teams have needed experience at wide receiver in order to have a big success. And for right now, Georgia's got less of that than other programs do. I think the ultimate answer to this question is how much Georgia benefits from the experience gained by two of its players on another roster and how quickly it can acclimate guys who have no experience at all, like Pickens and Blaylock, who we've talked plenty about on today's show. I think it kind of depends on what happens this summer because, as Jake Fromm explained during the spring, anytime you're trying to break in a new crop of wide receivers, it's really more about the chemistry that gets developed between that receiver and the quarterback, maybe as much as it is about knowing the playbook or knowing the opposing defense. But the relationship the signal caller has with the guy that he's tossing the ball to. In fact, here's what Fromm said about that then.
Yeah, reps, talking to them, getting a feel, seeing a lot of different looks from the defense. It really helps when the defense gives us their best look. And I think it really just comes down to a lot of reps, a lot of extra time watching film with those guys, seeing what they're seeing. Hey, this is what I'm seeing. It's just an ongoing back and forth. It's kind of like a conversation. And you just kind of start it that way and keep building it and keep throwing the ball.
I think it's really funny that Fromm used the word reps there, to my count, like 3 times. And right now, this summer, away from coaches and away from the media, I think Fromm's trying to get these reps with these guys. He was doing it before Holloman's dismissal, and will probably be doing it even more now, getting those guys on the same page. And I love his analogy that it's like a conversation. Listen to me talk to Mike Johnson on this show, someone I've talked to thousands of times. Listen to how free and easy and comfortable that conversation is, because we know each other really well. Compare that, though, to when I have an interview with somebody who's not on the show a whole lot. Listen to how different that conversation might sound. Not quite as comfortable, not quite as smooth. The quarterback's throwing to wide receivers, it may be somewhat the same way. Fromm's going to have to develop that comfort pretty quickly now because Georgia finds itself in kind of a unique situation. Now, here's what I'm a believer on when it comes to Georgia at the receiver position this fall. It is not in a scenario too dire to overcome it. Georgia can still be okay at wide receiver, and yet it is important to know just how challenging it's going to be. This is not as simple as some fans have claimed of, it's just next man up. You just push the next guy in there and Georgia's going to be fine. Stats matter. History matters. Precedent matters. And there's not a ton of precedent for no experience at receiver and success in an upcoming season. However, Georgia is not going to get a lot of sympathy from its rivals, just given how talented this overall crop of receivers would appear to be. So keep that in mind. By the way, 968 days. That's our Gator Hater Updater. We'll see you tomorrow here on DawgNation Daily. And on video. Good to have you all with us. Sorry, the topic at hand, at least when it comes to JJ Holloman, isn't more positive, but we got to deal with the news, whatever it is. And before we kind of dive into our comments, part of our R.S. Andrews cool down, I will tell you that, it's really funny to me, and I've mentioned this a million times. People will always ask, PA, I can't believe you do this show every day. How do you do this show every day? Y'all, Georgia is just an insane place to be talking college football because I swear to you, it seems like something gigantic and huge is happening here all the time. I often wonder, does it feel that way at Michigan too, at Texas, at these other kind of big, major state college, university, gigantic macro programs? Is it always something crazy going on there? Because here at Georgia, that would seem to be obviously the case. And, we're in the middle of June, and there was almost more stuff going on today than we could even cram into one show. So, listen, it's kind of a wild time, but we'll kind of deal and kind of do all that we can to get through this. And I am sure a lot of you have a lot of stuff to say here on this. So let's talk about this. Mike Mazzell says, "BA, just relax. We will be just fine." Now, I don't know that anything I just said a moment ago would be anything other than relaxed. I think that there is. I think that you have to, present the full spectrum of this. To flippantly look at this and say, we're going to be just fine. I think it's important to know that statistically speaking, Georgia's in kind of a rare category. I think that's important to know. However, I think you will also notice that in the midst of that conversation, I said that the situation is not so dire that Georgia can't overcome it. Let me, by the way, remind folks about our R.S. Andrews cool down. Air, heating, plumbing, electric. R.S. Andrews does all those things for you. This time of year, though, we kind of think about the air conditioning stuff probably a little bit more than most, just simply because of the fact that on a really, really hot day, and it was hot this morning when I left the house, but on a really, really hot day, you want the air conditioning inside your house to be working the way that it's supposed to That's why you want my friends at R.S. Andrews. You can find them online at rsandrews.com and get scheduled one of those $99 Smiley tune-ups. Story after story, R.S. Andrews have been delivering smiles for a long time. They can deliver smiles for you as well, but you got to reach out to them and get involved. rsandrews.com. They'll get your system back to factory fresh specs, and you'll be smiling in a nice, chilly, cool house, which is exactly what you want this time of year. John Arena says, yeah, it's nice we have depth, but it still is never good losing a number one. And, John, the point I want to make in response to that is, and I get what you're saying about losing a number one receiver. To me, though, this is not so much about losing the number one receiver off the roster, because I think there was a chance that in the right set of circumstances that someone could have overtaken Holloman as Georgia's leading receiver this year. Holloman was going to be among Georgia's top receivers no matter what. But in terms of someone having more receiving yards than Holloman, it was at least a possibility that could happen. For me, though, this is more about the idea of every receiving yard counts. And as I pointed out on Friday, you look at the crop of receivers that came in for Alabama in 2017, big-time recruits like Judy and Devontae Smith and Henry Ruggs. The leading receiver that year was still Calvin Ridley, a guy who had been on the roster. And you look at Clemson last year, Justin Ross makes all the headlines because he's the freshman. He comes in and plays great. And I've, as much as anybody, have touted the value of incoming freshmen because of what Ross was able to do. And yet it was still experienced guys who had been on the roster like T. Higgins, who also contributed a lot there. So it's beyond just who your number one receiver is. It's every receiving yard counting. And so you may have a newcomer that comes in and, lights the world on fire and becomes your leading receiver, but you still need quality guys around them. And as far as the overall depth at receiver at Georgia, it is better than most teams could ever dream of. But until recently, this was also the position group that I think Georgia just empirically, I'm talking about just measuring the data, empirically probably recruited less successfully than any other position group on the roster. So, this is not the same thing as if you had lost, some major offensive lineman or major outside linebacker or major inside linebacker. You could pick a lot of positions where Georgia's depth is laughable. It's so strong. The receiver position from a recruiting standpoint up until recently had not had that same level of recruiting success. Not a ton of top 10 guys, for instance, prior to 2019. Not a lot of five-star guys prior to 2019. So Georgia will feel this at the receiver position more so than it'll feel at other places. Now, some people sometimes only hear like one half of a conversation, whereas more than one thing can be true at once. Georgia can still weather the storm and still be fine. But I think it's a disservice to our audience to pretend like this isn't the kind of thing that is going to be challenging. Anything that exists in college football that most teams haven't had to do is always a challenge. Anytime you put yourself into a unique category, you've made the road to success harder. The less you look like the typical national champion, the more difficult your road's going to be. Doesn't mean that it's impossible. Doesn't mean there isn't a first time for everything. But one of the ways in which we frame our conversation around here a lot is, here are things about Georgia that look like the typical national champion, and here are things about Georgia that are a little atypical for college football national champions in the modern era. Anytime you're trying to win a championship running against the grain of what most teams have done, things are a little bit more difficult. And when it comes to experience the receiver position, Georgia is going to be a little different than the typical contender. Let's see what else is going on. Justin Dallas says Tommy Bush, on the subject of Tommy Bush, and I know that's one of those guys that some people now wonder about, because if you think, well, Holloman's gone, then everybody else kind of moves up a slot, and that hopefully means more of an opportunity for Tommy Bush. And I get the reason why Bush generates as many questions as he does, because he does look the part, right? I mean, from a physical standpoint, he looks very similar, tall, can run, got a little physicality you hope to him. He looks very similar to what Javon Wims proved to be for Georgia in 2017. And that's the high water mark for Georgia in receiving under the Kirby Smart era. Bush kind of looks like Wims a little bit, at least in terms of how we think he'd probably be able to play the game. But this is also one of those instances in which we probably have to look at the context clues here a little bit. Based on what Kirby Smart said during spring practice, what we saw with our own eyes in terms of the hierarchy at G-Day, it's fair to say that Bush right now is probably behind Matt Landers. And had Demetrius Robertson played on G-Day, probably behind him there as well. The same thing I think is kind of true for Karis Jackson here too. I won't begin to be able to tell you how Jackson or Bush would perform this year on the field, but I do feel confident in saying, in my belief, not based on reporting, but based on my reading of the situation, that as a slot receiver, Robertson was ahead of Jackson, and as an outside receiver, guys like Landers and others were probably ahead of Tommy Bush. The summertime is a chance for that to change. But my assumption is that's what the pecking order was after the spring concluded. J.J. McMillan says Hankton going to earn his check this year. And, yeah, there is a little extra attention paid on Hankton's ability to develop these guys. We have seen defensive backs at Georgia really develop. Eric Stokes is a better player right now than virtually anybody would have thought he would have been coming out of high school. Now, that's not because 3-stars can't succeed. It's just because, in comparison to the more elite recruits, the expectations would just be a lot higher for them. And yet Stokes right now is really playing well above his profile. DeAndre Baker before him did pretty much the same thing. At the receiver position, it'd be a really good situation for Georgia to also have that same kind of player development emerge, and I think that does put Hankton in the spotlight just a little bit. Cliff Hancock says Cage or Bush. Let me get the rest of Cliff's. I'm sorry, my Facebook's not cooperating. Robert Barnes says BA doesn't understand how important defense is to becoming a champion. So, Robert, what I will tell you is that in this modern age of football, offense has never been more important than it is right now. It's not to say that it's not to say that defense isn't important, but the old idea that defense wins championships, that would ignore how many points previous national champions have been scoring per game and the eruption of offense here. There are plenty of college football teams that are led by their defense and happy to win games 14-13, things along those lines. But for the most part, those teams are not competing at the national championship level. They are just not. And that's even more true at the NFL level, where defense has never mattered less. Defense has never mattered less in the NFL than it does right now. College football is a little different than that because you can still have a major talent advantage on defense. But for most teams, their most significant questions are going to come on the offensive side of the ball. And Georgia's probably not all that different from that. Now, you can make a case that Georgia has been better offensively than it's been defensively, and therefore Georgia has more significant questions on defense. And on that point, I'd probably agree. Statistically speaking, Georgia's offense has outperformed its defense in each of the last 2 years. But in terms of the overall direction of college football, that's just not the modern game. Ro Hawkins says, BA, do you think that Fromm and the wide receivers are on the field working right now? I mean, my assumption is they probably find some field to go to at some point in time, get some reps and some tossing, some things like that. Now, they've also, got some summer stuff there and probably enjoying here and there too. But, much the same way that you see these videos from Scott Sinclair of the lifting and the box jumps and everything else, for a lot of these guys, just getting used to how their ball rotates coming out of Fromm's hand and the way that, so-and-so receiver likes to run certain routes. Fromm described as a conversation. And my guess is that so-called conversation is ongoing. Martico Walker says, run the football and play good defense. And Martico, as we've said on here, that recipe right there, run the ball, play good defense, is a great way to dominate the SEC East. And it may be the recipe to a 12-0 regular season. But when you get into games against even competition, against a game where even a slight underdog, which Georgia probably would be right now to Alabama and likely would be against Clemson, when you get into those games, it's now about that extra dimension. Your receivers matter more in those games than they do in the other games. Because if you look at the NFL, for instance, if you wanted to predict the outcome of every NFL game, you could almost do simply by knowing what you call net yards per attempt. The yards per attempt for one quarterback subtracted by the yards per attempt from the lesser quarterback in the game. That one deal will tell you the outcome of more NFL games probably than any single stat does as well. That means against even competition, which most NFL games are, even talent on both sides. Quarterbacks throwing to receivers, defensive backs breaking up those passes. that becomes the most important aspect to this. So if Georgia's going to beat Alabama or Clemson, if it's going to play a team like Oklahoma in the college football playoff, a team like Ohio State in the college football playoff, suddenly receivers matter a lot more then. Honestly, I don't know that there's a single regular season game made all that much closer by JJ Holloman's absence, even Florida. I've seen some Florida message board stuff over the last 24 hours, and I'm sure you're very aware they're thrilled by this news. And Florida thinks of itself as having a pretty good secondary, and when it comes to cornerbacks, they probably are pretty good. And they're going to tell you, ooh, all of a sudden the job of defending Georgia just got much easier because J.J. Holloman's not on the field. I think that's, as you might imagine, an overly simplistic viewpoint of this. I don't think Holloman's absence makes it all that much harder to win any regular season game for Georgia. But I do think it makes beating Alabama a little tougher, and I think it makes beating Clemson a little tougher. Your top-end quarterback performance, your wide receiver performance, that matters more in the most important games you play. And for Georgia, those games aren't going to come until December and beyond. Jimmy Durham says, which receiver do you see Fromm making his go-to guy this season? For me personally, Jimmy, I think that's wide open. I think that's greatly up in the air. And as a fan, what I can tell you that I'm rooting for is for it to be one of the guys that I haven't seen. I'm always a big believer that the excitement rests with the thing you haven't seen yet, because if Pickens comes in, if Blaylock comes in, since we haven't seen them yet, since they are kind of a new commodity, there's always the chance that the overall production level for the Georgia wide receiver group is raised dramatically. Because of all the different position units on the Georgia roster, the two areas in which Georgia has been the farthest from kind of national championship quality have probably been with the pass rush and probably been with the wide receiver position. Those are the two areas in which Georgia has had the longest gap between what Georgia's performance has been and what the typical national championship team is. Georgia hasn't sacked the quarterback enough, and it really hasn't produced enough at the wide receiver position. That was an issue even if you had J.J. Holloman. Frankly, that would have been an issue even if Ridley, Hardman, and I guess and Nada had returned. That would have still been an issue there. Even if you brought back your juniors, the receiver position, Georgia would have still had question marks at the wide receiver spot, because the fact of the matter is, statistically, Georgia was just below the typical standard for national championship wide receivers. So that doesn't change all that much. This is still an area in which improvement's needed, but now that improvement's going to be required without a whole lot of experience. Let me go to YouTube for a moment, because I haven't been over there yet. Let's see what's going on over there. And we are going to have to get off the air here in just a little bit, because it seems like a lot of these days lately we got a lot going on here around here today. Dimitri Sullivan casting his lot with Matt Landers, saying that he's going to be our best deep ball and red zone threat. The kid has all the tools, so that's another vote there for Matt Landers. We've heard a lot of that in our comment section. And Dimitri, as I know you know, the one, I guess, opposite point on that is that Kirby has challenged Landers to be a little bit more consistent. That apparently he does in practice show that spectacular level of play that you just described, but on kind of the more mundane plays, maybe it sounds like Kirby's still looking for a little bit more from Landers, so we'll see if he's able to provide that. Crooking 123 says it's going to be defensive line next year. I'm telling you guys that Kirby has recruited terribly there recently. And so that would seem to be getting better with the 2019 class. We remember we got some fresh bodies for Georgia still yet to come in there, so that could change. And certainly it seems like defensive line's a priority in 2020. But I do think when it comes to the production you're seeing on the field, you can draw the line back to recruiting eventually. It all comes back to recruiting eventually. It's one of the reasons why we talk about recruiting so much on this program. And if you are settling for less than top 5 players at those positions, certainly top 10 at the least, but if you're settling for less than that kind of elite recruit over the course of a number of years, you are eventually going to have some problems in the field. It's just a fact. Dean Butler says, we will be fine. Yes, it's a blow, but we will have guys step up. Balls will be easy to catch when Fromm puts them on the money. And it is interesting to think about the fact that in terms of Georgia's need to sort of quickly develop some new receivers, and they were going to be doing this anyway. Now they'll be just doing it in one more additional spot. but you will have the opportunity to lean on Fromm a little bit more because of the experience that he has. Danny Blackman says, "BA, the pass rush was good in the SEC championship game. We were all over Tua." Yeah, until DeAndre Walker went out. That's certainly true. I think the problem from my end on that is that even in a game like that, where in the early going the pass rush was effective in doing its job, it was still heavily reliant on one player. And, you don't want to be, as Danny, I'm sure you would agree, you don't want to be that heavily reliant on just one player. Green Soldier says, "BA, I see an immense amount of talent, and our defensive backs will sharpen their wide receivers up. Iron sharpens iron." And Green, I think that's a really good point when it comes to what Fromm said a moment ago about how in the actual practices, because when Fromm made that statement, he was referencing spring practice. In the actual practices, getting a chance to battle against the Georgia defensive backs, and Kirby Smart will tell you, those defensive backs won this spring. They won that battle this spring. Kirby Smart was pretty clear about that. But in terms of getting better, going up against Eric Stokes and going up against Tyson Campbell and Devod Wilson, that's a better secondary you're going to face in most games. So from that standpoint, I think the Green Soldier is right, and he is right about a good number of things, is that, it's a little bit like swinging a baseball bat with like the biggest donut in the world on it. If you can swing that bat, you can do a lot better against Vanderbilt's secondary and Tennessee's secondary and things like that. Beef 73, by the way, mentions Corey Wren, says he reminds me a lot of Rentavious Wooten. It's kind of funny we didn't even mention Wren on today's show, which is probably a little bit of an oversight, but we'll certainly talk about him plenty. Boy, a lot going on. William Lee says about where JJ Holloman could go. He says he's not going to Auburn. The SEC doesn't allow domestic violence kids to transfer in the SEC. So one point of contention with that I'm not 100% clear about. Holloman was not charged with a crime. So by the letter of the law, I don't think he'd be prohibited from transferring within the SEC, and yet at the same time, I don't think he's going to an SEC school. If I had to guess, I think he's going to go play somewhere where he can play right now.
That's actually incorrect. As long as you are disciplined by the university regarding what is considered serious misconduct, which falls under sexual assault, domestic violence, or there's some third one, you will not be allowed. So
a university discipline counts as an admonition against that. So there's kind of rally on that.
I looked that up this morning.
One way or another, I don't think Holloman. I think Holloman's future is to try to play in the NFL because he's going to be a junior right now anyway. This is not some guy that I think is going to be playing at Big State U trying to win a national championship. I think he's going to go somewhere. This is my guess anyway. I think he's going to go somewhere where he can try to play a school that'll accept him right now, which is going to be kind of a lower level program. And then I think he's going to make a push to try to get to the NFL beyond that. And frankly, as I said during the regular show, I root for him in that process. I still do because listen, I think the number of things that you can do in college that get you expelled from society ought to be pretty short and pretty low. Even something as heinous as this allegation, I think there ought to be a path to recovery from this. But it can't be a free pass. Saying there's a path to recovery is not the same thing as giving a free pass because he's a good football player. That's not what I would want. But I also, at the same time, don't want him excluded from something that he's proven he can be exceptional at, simply because he did something allegedly terrible when he was 19 or 20 years old or whatever else. I think there's a way to see the full breadth of this story, that if Holloman's willing to do the work to figure out how to be a different person than the person who allegedly did this thing was, then I don't see how the world's made better excluding him from football. I completely understand why Georgia says we can't tarnish our brand by being connected to this right now. But as far as Holloman playing football again, I have no problem looking in this camera right now and saying, yes, I hope he gets a chance to do that.
Mm-hmm. He made a mistake. He loses the privilege that is to play football at the University of Georgia. But, he will be given a second chance, and, he's going to have to pay his price for this. And certainly getting kicked out of a university like Georgia, especially where he was expected to be a number one guy. And we'd even talked about the potential of him being a high draft pick in next year's NFL draft. He now has to take a much more difficult road because of his actions. And, it's on a level sad for all parties involved, because I don't largely believe that this is the person that Jeremiah Holloman is. I believe this is just, he made a very poor decision in a split-second instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things of for the man that's done this before, any man that's ever been in this situation, I think there's probably some commonalities there of they're not glad they did it. They're not proud of that decision. And frankly, there's probably a degree of confusion about why would I do this? What is inside of me that brought this out in this thing? And honestly, the men who take it the next step of actually wrestling with those questions and coming up with an answer and finding out a way how to rewire their brain so that violence isn't the outcome there. I mean, honestly, those really ought to be the heroes of our society because they choose to kind of go down their own sort of dark path to kind of figure out how to be a better person. And I commend anybody who's done that. The other thing I'm going to say here is, and this is a hot button. I'm going to take 2 seconds on this and then just leave it alone. The one thing I see in the comment section a lot, and I saw this some on Friday when this news first came out of, according to the Covington News report, she hit him first is the thing that comes up a lot. Here is the thing I am very comfortable with. In our society, there is a different standard for men in these situations than there are for women. And I am very, very comfortable with that. And the reasons why that different standard exists, the reasons for that, to me, are obvious. We want to live in a society where men are held to a different standard than women on this. We want to live in that society, and that's the society that we are in here. And deep down, we all know that. We all know that he's got a different obligation in these kinds of interactions because of reasons that I should not have to explain. All right.
So we talked. You mentioned the piece I wrote earlier this morning, and the big takeaway from that: only 2 of the 20 teams to make the college football playoff have had a leading receiver finish with fewer than 700 receiving yards.
Yeah.
Yes, Demetrius Robertson has done that before, but do you think there is do you think the new over-under for Georgia's leading wide receiver is 700? Do you think that there is a wide receiver that can get that?
I do, and I think if Georgia doesn't greatly exceed that, they're not winning the national championship. They're not. Georgia didn't win the national championship in 2017 with Javon Wims going 720. And I thought your point about D-Rob, what he did in the Cal uniform is really interesting because for he and Cage or both, that is a little bit of experience, although not in a Georgia uniform. Look, as I said a moment ago, and Connor, I'll give you a chance to respond to this. If JJ Holloman was playing, wide receiver is still a huge question mark for Georgia.
It's not a guarantee that he improves and becomes this guy who had 55 catches, 850 yards, and 9 touchdowns. It's not a guarantee that that's who he was going to be this fall.
If Hardman and Ridley were still here, and if Isaac Nada was still your tight end, in terms of pass-catching options for Jake Fromm, wide receiver would still be a huge question for Georgia. As much as I enjoyed watching Hardman play, as much as I enjoyed watching Riley Ridley play, neither one of them cracked 600 yards a year ago. And people have yelled at me for saying this. People don't like when I say this, but in terms of the typical national championship standard, and Connor's numbers back this up, I've said this a million times, the position group in which Georgia is the farthest from winning a national championship on paper based on the stats is the wide receiver position. Mm-hmm. So really, those questions aren't diminished because of what's going on here with J.J. Holloman. If anything, they're only now, I guess, more significant. But the overall story remains that in terms of Georgia winning a national championship, wide receiver has always been one of the top probably 2 questions on that. That really does not change. If Georgia's leading receiver only has 700 yards this year, which is way more than it had a year ago, but if it's only 700 yards this year, Georgia's not winning the national championship. I don't care how good the offensive line is. I don't care how good the running backs are. Even with the offense the way that it's currently constituted, you've got to have more big plays from a receiver than that. Or if you feel more comfortable saying more big throws to a receiver from Fromm, if you want to put the onus on him, you can do that if you want to. But one way or another, you've got to have more from your biggest weapons in the passing game, especially in the games that matter most. I just think that's inarguable based on the stats.
And, as high as we both are on Pickens and Blaylock, of the 20 teams to make the college football playoff, only 3 of them have gotten at least 700 yards. And I'm counting Justin Ross because he got 699, but he didn't even lead Clemson in receiving yards through the regular season last year. That was actually T. Higgins, which you had pointed out in sort of our work email chat on Friday. 3 receivers have had 700 yards going into the playoff. Justin Ross, who actually had 699, but we'll round up because that's essentially 700. Marquise Brown in 2017, he was a JUCO transferred in, finished with over 1,000 yards, and then Calvin Ridley in his freshman season in 2015 with Alabama. That is the list. A lot of these guys who, are the leading receiver, they tend to be juniors, seniors. It is a very rare, even Jerry Jeudy and Higgins last year, those guys were the exception to sort of the rule of sophomores and younger players producing well at that position.
Steve Banks says, let's revisit this topic in the middle of the season. I bet it proves that we were worried about too much. But here's the thing, Steve, though I feel like I need to say this over and over again. I am not saying Georgia cannot overcome this obstacle. Connor's not saying that Georgia cannot overcome this obstacle. What we are saying is the obstacle exists. And if Georgia does overcome it, it should be treated as what it is, which is an incredible performance by Georgia for doing what a lot of teams have not done, which is find success in the passing game without a ton of returning experience at the receiver position. So I think you really do a disservice to Georgia when you say, this is no big deal. Next man up. It's fine. We got a 4-star. We'll just throw him in there and everything's going to be fine. I really think you're doing a disservice to Georgia, or someone is doing a disservice to Georgia when they act like that this is just, push a button and, all things are equal. I mean, as I said during the regular show, anytime that as a national champion, you're trying to put yourself into a unique category, different than previous teams who've won the championship, your road's just going to be more difficult. It's just going to be tougher when you don't have the same characteristics that previous champions do. It's one of the reasons why you hear me all the time say the number of teams that can even win a championship is probably 6 names long, maybe 7. It's not 10. It's certainly not 15 or 20. I mean, you got 130 teams playing at the FBS level. I'm going to tell you right now, there's not more than 6 or 7 who could even win a national championship. So within that 6 to 7, how different is Georgia from the previous teams who've won one? I think those questions are fairly significant.
Yeah, when I went on Feinbaum on Friday to sort of explain everything, he asked me, does this remove Georgia from being a team that can win a national championship? It does not.
No, it does not.
It does, however, I believe, make the task of winning a national championship harder, if that makes sense. It is one. Wide receiver was the second biggest question mark going into this season anyway for me, behind the defensive line, and now it still probably is the number 2 concern because, admittedly, I am still very high on Dominic Blaylock. I think he's going to be a very, very good player for Georgia. I think Georgia getting Pickens in when they did, he's going to be a very, very good player for them. Lawrence Cager needs to play well this year now. Demetrius Robertson needs to play well now this year. Tyler Simmons needs to take on an even bigger role in the offense than he was expected to. All those things are true, and yet I still believe and will still probably predict Georgia to win a national championship this year.
Marcinio Askew says, think positive. This is why we recruit. All champions overcome adversity. Totally agree with you on the last part of that every team that's ever won any championship has had to overcome some adversity along the way. This just happens to be Georgia's particular level of adversity. But on the notion of this is why Georgia recruits, it pains me to say this, but it's true. Georgia's history of being an elite recruiting program at the wide receiver position is like 1 year old. I mean, if you want to go back to some of those previous recruiting classes, in terms of the kind of the top 5 at the position level recruiting that Georgia seems to do at every other position, for wide receiver, that's actually a fairly new phenomenon. Georgia went from 2009 until, was it this past year, without signing a top 10 receiver?
They went a decade without signing a 5-star or a top 5 wide receiver. And before you bring up Terry Godwin and Mecole Hardman, those guys were classified as athletes.
And that's not any disrespect to the guys that Georgia has, because I'm a big believer in what a lot of those guys might be able to do. But it's worth pointing out that if you had to deal with unprecedented depletion of experience, you would not typically want that to be at the position where you've also had the least history of recruiting top-flight players, and in Georgia's case, that's what's true. But this is also a situation where one receiver can make a really big difference.
Yep.
It's a little bit like basketball in that, if Ant-Man Anthony Edwards comes in on the floor in Segment Coliseum, and if he's as good as everybody thinks, guess what? Everybody else has got a little bit better too, because you have to really, really focus in on stopping that one guy. If George Pickens comes in here and he's everything the 5-star is supposed to be, then there are going to be more open routes over the middle for slot guys. The guy on the opposite sideline of Pickens, his job just got easier. And you could also say that about, an older D-Rob or a Dominic Blaylock or, anybody else, that if you get one guy who pops, then everything else just got way easier. Cliff Hancock says, can y'all get some comments from Fromm on this? He'll know better than all of us. And if Jake did speak on this, and at some point in time he will, but if he did speak on this, no doubt he'll be like Marcinio Askew and be very positive about it all, which is what you want him to be. I don't think there's any doubt that Fromm's a believer in the guy that he in the guys that he has, even minus Holloman. There's no doubt that he's still a big believer in these guys, and you want to lean on that confidence from Fromm to help develop these guys. There is something I believe in life about fake it till you make it, and this Georgia receiving corps this season will probably do some of that. A little bit of believing they're better than they have a right to until the point in time, as one of our commenters said a moment ago, until it is the middle of the season, they really have found that level of productivity. I think they probably will lean on Fromm's confidence, not just confidence in himself, but I believe they'll lean on Fromm's belief in them because Fromm's proven that he's a pretty good leader there in that regard. Tyler Burrow says, any update on Dwan Mathis? Is he recovering, rehabbing okay? I mean, he is out of the hospital now, and that process is for him ongoing. Kirby Smart did not want to put any kind of timeline on that when he spoke about this most recently. But there's no reason to think this is not going to be an effective recovery. I'm going to guess this in some form or fashion does impact him this season because even if it puts him behind on starting practice, that's going to have a domino effect that kind of, affects his timing for preparation the rest of the year. So there's almost no doubt in my mind this does have some sort of 2019 impact on him. And yet the overall more important issue is no reason to think that he's not on his way to a fully healthy recovery, which is the best news of all here. Just what looks to be about to be a happy ending for Mathis and what could have been otherwise a scary situation. But if you want to keep this the parameters of football, this almost certainly has to have some sort of short-term impact on him. My guess is it's not a long-term impact, but in the short term, in the immediate, this has to impact his preparation just a bit, I would say. Let me go get some more Facebook comments, and we'll do some other stuff. Randy Hall also brings up a fair point that the offensive line is going to give Fromm plenty of time to choose his open wide receivers. And, one of the things I would like to have seen more from Jake is kind of some of that stuff of checking down to third and fourth options, really shopping around for the best opportunity. And with the offensive line that we presume is going to perform as effectively as it does, breaking in new receivers, it certainly helps to have a gigantic, very good offensive line as an ally. And I think that Randy makes a good point about that. Georgia probably will utilize that this year. Matt Rukavina says, if Kendall Milton or Rick Gilbert and Keely Ringo will just commit, that's going to cure all ills. Matt, I like the way you think on that. I think that's really well done. Let me go over to YouTube.
Do you feel less confident about Zach Evans now that he's publicly visiting A&M, publicly visiting Texas?
Oh yeah. Which is fine.
Yeah.
I mean, as I said before, and I think I've said this a couple times, head-to-head against any of Georgia's or any of Evans' stated finalists, I think that Georgia could win that battle. I think that Georgia could still win the battle between Texas or Texas A&M. I do think it becomes difficult to say, Evans, leave the pull of your home state to come to Georgia and be part of a package deal, because I'm not trading. I like Zachary Evans a lot, and many of you like him better, but I'm not trading Milton for Evans. Evans, for me, has always been in addition to Kendall Milton type situation. And so when you say, strong pull from his in-state schools, a part of a package of running backs at Georgia that likely includes Kendall Milton, or at least could possibly include Kendall Milton, it's the tandem of those two issues that I think becomes really important, really difficult at that point in time. And I know this sounds dumb, but the fact that he did not include Texas or Texas A&M in his finalists makes me think that the pull to those schools is even stronger.
Yep.
And somehow this has all been part of it.
Was anybody really considering that like A&M and Texas were out of it because they weren't named him in his top 5?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, on this show, from pretty much the get-go, you and I both said that we thought they were still going to be a major player. Big Dog Fan on YouTube says, BA, give me your top 3 receivers this year. All right, let me see if I can think about this and just rattle this off the top of my head. I am now going to take both the freshmen, with apologies to Micaiah Tongue. I'm going to take Dominic Blaylock and George Pickens as 2 of those 3. And the third, I'm going to say, is now Tyler Simmons. I'll take Simmons, the vet. I'll take the 2 freshmen with Lawrence Cager just on the outside looking in, and possibly D-Rob just on the outside looking in. But I'll probably rank Cager now ahead of D-Rob, and I'll take Pickens, Blaylock, and Simmons. That's my top 3. That's what I'm saying. Connor, do you agree? He's not even listening. Did you hear the question, Connor?
I did not. Sorry, I'm responding to G Grace.
Okay.
In, YouTube comment section.
Lord knows that takes a lot out of you.
Find another losing battle today.
No. Dimitri Sullivan says I just named the whole core. No. I gave my top 3 pretty clearly.
Yeah.
I said Pickens, Blaylock, and Simmons are my top 3. But then I give you the ranking outside of that. My 3 though are Pickens, Blaylock, and Simmons. Do you agree with that top 3?
I will go Blaylock, Cager, Pickens for a top 3.
Oh, I didn't put them in order in the top 3, but it's the same top 3 though, right?
No, you had Simmons, I had Cager.
Oh, so see, I think that I wouldn't have had Simmons in my top 3 before, but I do believe he becomes more important now.
Did you? I thought you said Simmons.
I did.
I'm saying my top 3 is Blaylock, Cager, Pickens.
And what I'm saying is I now believe that Simmons, I'm arguing for why I included Simmons.
Yes.
I think he's more important now because I do think there's something to chemistry. And there's something to throwing to a guy you've thrown to before.
Yes, and I do value that, and I do realize the 3 receivers I listed are all new guys. I think Cager, because he is he's clearly an outside receiver, where Simmons, there are questions about his size. I think that Cager is someone who, and because he has done it on a Power 5 level, granted, not at Georgia, I do think that he's gonna be someone they maybe look to early on and try to really get him going and integrate him into the offense.
GB2 says, what about Matt Landers? Matt Landers may just absolutely light the world on fire this summer, but I'm basing this on the stuff that happened during the spring and my assumption about the 2 freshmen. I just think that you've got to look at a few people being considered ahead of him on the depth chart. And it's different position alignments, obviously. Landers is probably an outside guy. D-Rob is probably an inside guy. But, D-Rob right now is probably ahead of Landers in terms of a hierarchy in that receiver position. Is Kyrus Jackson? What do you think between Kyrus and Landers? Different positions probably, but in terms of the hierarchy in the receiving pecking order, is who's ahead of whom?
I would probably say Landers based off what I saw at G-Day. And I do think, when you factor in the slide, you've got guys like Blaylock probably going to really challenge Kyrus. You've got Demetrius Robertson, who's probably really a challenge there. Even Tyler Simmons can play some slot view given his speed. I think right now there's an easier path to playing time at the outside wide receiver position than I do at the inside wide receiver position.
Jay Kennedy says, it's D-Rob Pickens, and he says, and it's Tommy Bush. Bush is another one of those guys, if you just read kind of the between the lines, it seems like he's got a lot to make up for, but this leads us to a different conversation. It is fair to say that JJ Holloman came out of nowhere last year. Because Holloman was he played well at 2017 G-Day. That doesn't really matter a ton. In terms of the level of performance he had on the field, that was not predicted by his first season on campus. It just was not. So, Connor, if I were to say to you, who could be this year's JJ Holloman, which is playing well after not really having a lot of predictions to that preseason, who is the best candidate for that?
I'm going to go way off the board here.
All right.
Way off the board.
All right.
Can I give you Trey Blunt?
That's a pretty good one. I'd be as happy as I could be. Oh, my gosh, I'm glad we're talking about this. If you gave Blunt that chance, I'd be as happy as I could
Crow
be.
King mentions Kyrus Jackson, too. I think that's the other answer. I think it's Jackson, and I think it's Trey Blunt.
Okay. Yeah, those are 2 pretty good answers there. Here's the thing about Trey to remember. He played a lot in 2017. Did not play much last year. Played a lot in 2017 because they do value his physicality. So you got no problem putting him out there because of that. But here's also the thing. I don't know how many career catches Blunt has, but I'm pretty sure he has 0 career drops. When they've thrown to him, he's caught the ball. For whatever reason, I've just always been a fan of Trey. We did a Marlowe's thing with him one time, and he just came across as a good dude. So I've always liked Trey. So he would certainly fit the bill of a guy that really, really breaks out. Chip Gromlich says he was in the game on the winning Rose Bowl play. Yeah, and that's how much they valued him. Back that year, he was a guy they really trusted as a physical receiver. Easy Brown also says that Tommy Bush would factor into that. Yeah, Bush would be a little bit like JJ Holloman if he were to have a breakout this year. It would be a pretty good recruit, but a guy that didn't really show you a lot in his first year on campus. So if it could happen for Holloman a year ago, you could say, why couldn't it happen for Bush this year? And it's probably a fair question to ask. Alex Dean says, I don't think that Jackson Landers or Bush are on that level. Yeah, and you're right, Alex. But also the point is that no one would have thought that about Holloman a year ago. I mean, he played better than the preseason predictions for him would have suggested. Oh, this is a really good point.
Comment section is bringing it today.
Yeah, Chase Smith has a great comment. It's maybe the best comment of the day. He says, I'd be more worried about losing Holloman's downfield blocking rather than his wide receiver abilities. I do know this. He absolutely sprang, 2 gigantic DeAndre Swift touchdowns against Kentucky. He probably did.
He had one against in the Auburn game as well.
He was great at that really good downfield block, and some of Swift's best highlights were really connected to a downfield a Holloman block. That's a really, really good point. And another reason why, hey, maybe it's that extra look for Trey Blunt here. Joel Moody says, what about Micaiah Tongue? Is he working at wide receiver and on defense? I think he certainly came to Georgia because he wants to play wide receiver. He made that pretty clear. I have also suggested that I'd love to give him a look at defensive back and see how that goes. I'd love to do that. I love that body type as a defensive back. But he came to Georgia because he wants to play wide receiver. I don't know how he factors into all this. I don't. I get accused a lot of not talking enough about him. I guess one of the reasons why I don't talk as much about him is because I don't know how he fits into all this. If I was Kirby Smart's boss, I'd probably say, what do you think about Micaiah Tongue maybe on that defensive side of the ball? I would definitely think about that. But that's not why he came to Georgia. That's not what he wants to do, I don't believe. And Jeff Sintel's done plenty of reporting on that. Do you have an opinion on that, Connor, as to how Tongue may fit into this?
I admittedly just don't know a whole lot about Tongue. Obviously he looked very good playing at a high level in Louisiana. And he is a big-bodied receiver. I think he has very similar body type to Holloman. I just think he's a guy where if he came in, because remember, none of the wide receivers that Georgia signed in this past class came in January, and Kirby Smart openly lamented that during spring practice. I think, if Tongue was a guy who came in during the spring and sort of worked and got sort of used to the Georgia program, I actually do think he's someone who could have contributed this year, certainly as a blocking wide receiver, just given, his size and the sort of offense he played in high school. But, I do think he's going to start out as a wide receiver, and I think, Holloman off a team that might actually keep them there long term, whereas some people have thought he might be defensive back.
Jake Kennedy says, actually, let me get Joel Moody first, and I'll get Jake Kennedy next, and we're going to get off the air. Joel says, going back to size as a defensive back, is that why Ringo is one of our top recruits? Dude has great size as a defensive back. Yeah, I just love it. I just love these big defensive backs. I think they are very, very difficult to deal with. Now, you do see kind of an interesting trend for a while. It seems like receivers were getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and as Connor's pointed out before, all of a sudden now receivers are kind of going back the other direction here a little bit, and Georgia's most recent commit may be the best example of that, as a way of combating the fact that so many good NFL defensive backs are also now getting to be kind of bigger guys. But that's why I love Ringo, is because when it's all said and done, they're just going to be a lot of big, tall, strong receivers trying to get over on what has historically been a much smaller position at defensive back. When you have a Ringo, a guy like that, big, long arms, little size to him, I think it's a gigantic weapon. That is really why I like Ringo as much as I do, and absolutely. Now, Jake Kennedy says that he thinks Lawrence Cager is coming in overhyped. Here's where I think it's important to remind, if you're in this comment section, we're talking about this every day, by the time the season gets here, everybody's overhyped because we talk about this every day. I think the average Georgia fan, though, has talked about Lawrence Cager a lot less than we have on this show. We have done it because we talk about everybody, over the course of the summer a few times. So I wouldn't take the level of conversation that exists around Cager on this program to necessarily be representative of the way that most of the country thinks about him, or even most Georgia fans. I think the nation doesn't even realize that Georgia probably has a transfer coming in from Miami because Cager, wasn't perfect over there. The thing that I do like about him is he's caught touchdown passes. So from that standpoint, I think he has some value. But if he was, an all-ACC receiver, he wouldn't be leaving Miami. So from that standpoint, I think it's important to put that hype in context. And to the average Georgia fan, and if you're in this comment section, you're not the average Georgia fan. You're kind of more on the more plugged in end of things. But to the average Georgia fan, the average Georgia fan, the guy that you talk to at your tailgate, somebody like that, or at least some of the people you talk to at your tailgate, they don't even know that Lawrence Cager on this roster. So
right.
I wouldn't put Lawrence Cager in the overhyped category, because even those of us who have followed his transfer story pretty closely would say it's a little bit questionable about how much of an impact he can make because of the overall profile that he put up there in Miami.
And Jake Fromm is, I don't know if there's a measurement of distance in terms of how much greater a quarterback he is than Malik Rozier.
That's true.
Or whatever Miami's starting quarterback situation was.
And Shannon Baker points it out too. You're absolutely right about that. Any final thoughts from anybody? Connor, I'll
Cliff
start
Payne
with you.
brings up a really good point. Cager's numbers, I believe 21 catches, 324 yards, 6 touchdowns, were pretty similar to Holloman's 24 catches, 418 yards, and 5 touchdowns. And again, with a much worse quarterback throwing Cager the ball than Holloman was. So it's a very interesting point.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. All right, we're going to get ready to get out of here today. Appreciate you being a part of our program. Huge thanks to R.S. Andrews for making the R.S. Andrews Cool Down possible. Make sure you check out that $99 Smiley tune-up. They'll get your air conditioning unit back to factory fresh specs. Check them out online at rsandrews.com. I'll be back tomorrow, 10 a.m. for DawgNation Daily. We'll have more on the recruiting impact of Akinola Ogunbiyi's decommitment. We'll need to talk a little bit about Corey Wren as well, because we really have not done that yet. We'll do a lot of that with Jeff tomorrow too, and more of the fallout for where Georgia goes next, the wide receiver position. We'll do it all. We're glad you're with us. And by the way, next week I am on vacation, so go ahead and I'll start kind of letting you know about that and getting you prepared for that. We'll be on vacation next week, but looking forward to being back the week after that for the full ride all the way through college football playoff, signing days, and everything else. We'll do all of that with you starting tomorrow at 10 right here on DawgNation Daily. Have a great day, everybody.